Good morning, and thank you for joining us for Session 3, the E-rate overview for new applicants. This should be the final session and would wrap everything up for you as you learn all about E-rate. It's Rebecca and Roxy again, and we appreciate you taking time out of your morning this Tuesday before Thanksgiving break. As usual, we are recording this session and we'll post the recording as well as the slide deck to our website for you to review if you need to. I'm going to begin the session and then Rebecca's going to pick up at the end. As usual, please post your questions in the chat box and we will have a Q&A at the end as well. Okay, let's move on. Let me get this to where it'll move forward. Okay, the first thing we're going to talk about is compliance and post-commitment. Well, actually, that slide is out of, oops, sorry. Our training topics for today are application review, funding commitment, document retention, program compliance, and other reviews. All right, so the first thing is the review of your 471. So where we left off last time was that you had submitted your 471 and asked for funding for your projects or your services. So what happens when you submit that 471 is it goes through Program Integrity Assurance, or PIA for short. So that's what we call it, is PIA. So that is the first round of reviews. Every application goes through it, whether you get questions or not. Sometimes if you're in a recurring contract, like for Internet or WAN, if it's a new contract, they'll reach out and ask you questions. But maybe in year 2 of the contract, they're still going to look at it. They may not ask you questions because they've already asked you questions in year 1, but it still gets a review. Okay, so every contract or every 471 is going to go through PIA. They're going to verify eligibility of your schools or your libraries or even your student counts. They're going to verify the requested services, which is usually they're going to ask for your quote and your contract, which is why you need to have that contract up in your contract module. And they may ask for any additional documentation related to your funding request. You have 15 days to respond to the PIA questions, and that does include weekends. You can request one automatic 7-day extension, such as you may be on vacation during part of this time, or it may take a long time to get all this information together. So you can get an automatic 7-day extension with no questions asked, okay? If you need help understanding the PIA questions, you ask your reviewer for help because you will have their email address and you simply reply to them and say, okay, I need help. But also a first line in helping you with these PIAs are Rebecca and myself. So lots of times you can say, okay, help me answer this question. And 99.9% of the time we've seen the question before, we know exactly what they want, and we can tell you not only what to upload or how to answer the question, but how to do it really, really fast. Okay? All right, to answer the inquiries or ask for extensions or find your reviewer's contact information, you simply go into your 471 and EPC and respond to the inquiries under related actions. Okay, but the kicker here is you have to be in the 471 itself that is asking the questions. And if you have multiple 471s, you need to make sure you're navigated into the right one. Okay. Make sure you make any changes to your application before funding. Any applications to the services, any applications to the numbers, any applications to the entities, anything like that, okay? So after you send in your 471, if you've realized you've made an error, you should have, say for example, you meant to ask for 50 access points instead of 45, or the model, you keyed it in wrong, or you should have asked for 2 gigs instead of 1 gig on your WAN. So there's a clerical error. A lot of this can be taken care of through the RAL process or the receipt acknowledgement letter process, or you can do it through PIA with your reviewer. Okay, so a RAL process is simply submitting a change to your 471 before you go into PIA review or before it's funded, and you say, I made an error, let's make these changes. And it's real simple to do, and Rebecca and I can help you do that. Or if you don't realize you made a mistake and the mistake is caught during PIA, your reviewer can help you make those changes. Okay? All right, so once everything has been reviewed and your reviewer says you're waive ready, you're going to be funded. So you will then receive what's known as an FCDL, or a Funding Commitment Decision Letter. Your Funding Commitment Decision Letter will include USAC's decisions on your funding request. It'll be your commitment amount, any modification that was made during PIA, or any denials. Okay, so what they've started doing now is they're funding it, but funding it as zero, which is a denial. They're funding it at a reduced amount if you guys are over budget or you've agreed to reduce the cost on something. So you still get a FCDL, but it's going to be funded at varying amounts. For example, if you have to cancel the 471, you'll still get an FCDL, but it'll say funded at $0, which is confusing, I know. FCDLs are emailed out to the contact person on the Form 471, so whoever it is that fills out that 471 and is the contact person is the person who gets the FCDL. Okay? And if you disagree with their decisions, you have to file an appeal. Okay, and I've hyperlinked how to file an appeal here. Okay. Okay, now this is what an FCDL looks like that comes into your email, and this is one from one of our applications this year. So you get 2 attachments in your email, and you have to keep both of them. It's very important. One is a document that starts out with page 1 like this, and it tells you the total commitment. And if you keep scrolling, it has page after page after page after page of your FRNs and what each FRN is committed to. Then the second thing you'll have is a spreadsheet. Now the spreadsheet literally goes on horizontally across the page, and what I did was I just copied it and transposed it so that you could see it here in more of a vertical alignment. So if you look down here in the middle, you can see that you see that we asked for $9.4 million on this application. We were 86% discount rate, so they're committing to pay at USAC $8.1 million on this application. So on the left, on the blue bar, you see their commitment is 8.1, which is what they've committed to pay. So we, DPI, will pay the difference, which is 14%, the difference between the $9.4 million and the $8.1 million. And in case you want to know, yes, this is only one of our 4 applications to pay for internet in the state of North Carolina. Okay, so I've been funded, now what? I've got my FCDL, what do I do next? All right, first of all, you have to comply with the Children's Internet Protection Act. This is law. The Children's Internet Protection Law is a law in the state of North Carolina, everybody else's law across the United States, and the FCC says you must comply with this if you want E-rate money. Okay? So it is a congressional act. All right, so this is what it says. Schools and libraries must enforce certain safety measures that protect against access by adults and minors to obscene content on the internet. So obscene is a big word there. There are 3 requirements: an internet safety policy, a technology protection measure, and a public notice and hearing or meeting. So you have to meet all 3 of those, and you have to document that you have met these 3 requirements and keep them in your E-rate documentation. That's the next bullet. The school or library must maintain documentation demonstrating that they are working toward compliance in the very first year of existence. That would be a new charter school, or in compliance the second year and thereafter. So this is what your internet safety policy must address. So if you're a new charter, you need to pay very close attention to this. Access by minors to inappropriate matter on the internet and World Wide Web. The safety and security of minors while using electronic mail, chat rooms, and other forms of direct electronic communications. Unauthorized access, including hacking and other unlawful activities by minors online. Unauthorized disclosure, use, or dissemination of personal information regarding minors, and measures designed to restrict minors' access to materials harmful to minors. For schools, you have additional requirements. You must include monitoring of their online activities, and you must provide it for the education of minors about appropriate online behavior, including interacting with other individuals on social networking websites and in chat rooms, cyberbullying and awareness and response. So that education piece came in a few years ago, I believe maybe 2012, and you are held accountable for that as well. The documentation must also be kept for how you're educating your children to meet these requirements. All right, so what is the technology protection measure? This is the content filter. And if you are on NCRIN, which is the state's free internet, we provide a free content filter, or you're free to purchase your own content filter, but you must have a filter in place, okay? So it blocks or filters internet access, and you have to set up what gets blocked. If you're on the states, we block it for you, okay? So entities must enforce the operation of the technology protection measure during the use of its computers with internet access. A person authorized by the authority with responsibility for administration of the school or library may disable the technology protection measure during use by an adult to enable access for bona fide research or other lawful purpose. So this applies to libraries. And decisions about what matter is inappropriate for minors are made by the local community, school board, local education agency, library, or other authorities. So this usually encompasses pornography and anything to do with sexual acts, body parts, because, you know, kids are curious and they tend to type in words that they've heard their friends speak or spoken at home. Okay, what about this public notice and hearing or meeting? Schools, libraries, charters, you must provide a public notice and hold at least one, just one, public hearing or meeting to address the internet safety policy. You have to provide notice to this group that this meeting is being held. So you advertise it on your website. That's the public notice, okay? Additional meetings are not necessary even if you amend the policy unless it's required by your local rules. So all the FCC requires is that one meeting be held. But if your local rules require multiple meetings be held, if a policy is amended, then by all means you must follow your local rules. So you must document that this public notice was given, the meeting was held, you need to keep minutes, copies of the announcements, and of course you'll have a copy of the policy. So a board agenda, the minutes once it was approved, and that sort of thing when you put the policy in place, okay? So if you have any questions, go ahead and, jot these down on your scratch sheet of paper or put them in the chat box, and we'll revisit these in just a minute. Okay. A copy of your internet safety policy, that's what an ISP is, along with any updates to your policy needs to be kept. Documentation of the adoption of the policy must also be kept. Documentation for your filter must be kept. If you buy your own filter, you might want to keep a copy of the purchase order and the quote. A report on the use of filter needs to be kept, maybe a yearly report. You can get those from your dashboard from MCNC, or have your IT people, if you run your own filter, run you a yearly report, and you put that in your E-rate documentation for the year, okay? archived logs, for example, showing the hours the filter was engaged, a report of sites blocked, like I said, your PO for the filter, if you bought your own, a copy of the quote. All that goes in your documentation every year. Documentation for the public notice and hearing. As I mentioned earlier, that you gave public notice, that you held the public notice, a copy of the website announcement, so that's a screenshot. An advertisement in the paper if you run it in the paper, just whatever is required by your local rules, a copy of the minutes, a copy of the agenda, so forth and so on, and then a copy of the policy as well. All right, so once you have met all the SIPA requirements, you're going to certify this with the Form 486. So after you have your funding commitment decision letter, the next step is to file your Form 486, which starts your services and certifies your SIPA compliance. So that's what the two things that the Form 486 does. So you'll see these two bullets here. You notify USAC that the services have started, so you can order your equipment and start your internet or WAN services and report your status of compliance with the Children's Internet Protection Act. If you are in year one, you're a brand new charter school, you would be working on becoming compliant. After year one, you should be compliant. There is no excuse after year one. Okay, what is your service start date? Because one thing the 486 is going to ask you is, what is your service start date? Services should start on or before July 1st. We always tell you to put July 1, even though you might not have gotten a funding commitment decision letter till after July 1, because it messes up everything in the world of EPC and USAC, because they don't truly understand anything other than July 1. We've been down this road multiple times. You can do any day after July 1 as well. If your services start after that day, but it's always best just to put July 1, because even if you're, let's say you're putting in a WAN service, they don't start billing you till September for some strange reason. More than likely they connected you on July. They just haven't got your billing together. So we always encourage you just to put July 1. And for Category 2, it doesn't really matter what your service start date is, because you're just paying a one-time invoice. When do you file the Form 486? It must be certified no later than 120 days after the service start date reported on your 486, or 120 days after the funding commitment decision letter, whichever is later. We like to remind you as soon as you get your FCDL just to go ahead and file it and get it out of the way, because if you forget to file it, your service start date is going to be adjusted. Okay, and it really affects invoicing. Your vendor can't invoice, you can't invoice, and then you have to file an appeal. So there's some issues if you don't file it. After you do file it, you'll get a notification that the form was certified, and then you'll get a second notification stating that it was reviewed and informing you of the decision. After it is reviewed and notified and approved, you can begin invoicing. So invoicing is an important part. That's where the money comes in. USAC has started sending urgent reminder notifications to let you know if you have not reported a service start date, meaning you have not filed your 486, so that you can file it without penalty. We hope, Rebecca and I, to get to you before USAC does and remind you to file these. Most people, like I said, file them right after they're funded, because we send you the reminder notices, hey, you've been funded, let's go ahead and get your 486 filed and get that out of the way. But USAC will send you some reminders as well. Okay, I believe, Rebecca, you're coming in now with post-commitment.
That is correct. And one more thing about that 486, That is one form that it is really, really difficult to get an appeal for. We've seen appeals be denied. I mean, there has to be a really compelling reason that the 486 was failed to be filed. So, stressing, and it's a simple form. It takes just a couple of minutes to fill it out. But it will stop you dead in the water if you don't do it. So we can't stress enough the importance of that Form 486. So when we start nagging you, please pay attention, because we just want you to be able to get your money, and this will stop it for sure. So let's talk a little bit about post-commitment. That's after the FCDL is filed and after the 486 is filed.
Sorry. I forget I have control.
Okay. The thing everybody wants to talk about is, how do I get my money? Invoicing. There are two ways of getting that discount money. SPI billing, SPI, which is service provider invoicing, and that way the service provider only bills the applicant for the non-discounted amount, and that vendor or service provider goes to USAC and invoices USAC for the discounted amount. The other method is filing a Form 472, commonly referred to as the BEAR, which is Billed Entity Applicant Reimbursement, and that is where the applicant pays the whole bill up front and then goes in to USAC and files Form 472 to get their money back. In order to do that, you've got to have a BEAR PIN number, and it will sometimes take 7 to 10 days, sometimes even more, to get that PIN number. You also must have a Form 498 completed and approved, and that gives USAC your entity's banking information. So that is because the money comes directly from electronic funds transfer, EFT, directly to the bank account. Okay? So those are the two different methods of invoicing. Okay, post-commitment notifications. We get revised funding commitment, excuse me, decision letters, RFCDLs, and those are also submitted through the EPIC system, and that will be an appeal, a SPIN change, that service provider identification number change, a service substitution, a form, FCC Form 500. And prior to, for 2015 and prior, everything was on paper. And so 2016 and forward, everything is in the EPIC system. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about appeals. And this we talked about the 486. If you forget to file your 486 or have some kind of compelling reason that it didn't get done, you'll have to file an appeal. An appeal is a request for USAC to review a decision that was made. You could file a decision about your funding commitment. Service providers can appeal a USAC decision, and all these appeals are now filed in EPIC. The first appeal you would do is appeal to USAC. Okay, included in the USAC appeal would be your billed entity number and or your service provider ID number, all of your contact information, and who, including the name of the person or persons who can speak to the appeal. A nickname for the appeal, just like everything else in the EPC system, we put in a nickname with our school name, the fiscal year, identifying information so that you can glance at it and know. Also, the USAC EPIC system is going to give an appeal number. Be sure and write that down or print it out so that when you follow up on your appeal, you'll have the appeal number. Excuse me again. The funding year for the decision of the appeal. And of course, the funding year begins with the July 1st year that for E-rate. Funding request numbers, or FRNs, associated with your appeal. And then the decision that is being appealed. Then a narrative that explains what you're looking for. What kind of relief are you being sought? It could be the amount. It could be a deadline date. It could be this 486 deadline date. Anything within the funding commitment that documents what relief is being sought, what you want to change about your decision. And then you have supporting documentation, such as your forms and any correspondence that gives rise to prove or supports what you're claiming. So if it's a precedent that was set before, you'll need to review that and put the information that you have. Excuse me again. Okay. Appeals may be granted under the circumstances. If the appeal makes it clear that USAC made an error, let's say the PIA reviewer made an error and it got put on into your funding request, or if you have new information or documentation that didn't get provided to that PIA reviewer when it was going through the original review, that could be provided. Or if USAC gets a policy clarification or has a new policy that may impact the original decision. Okay. After you file an appeal with USAC, whether it's if that is denied, then you have to go to the FCC and seek some type of resolution through the FCC. And if you're seeking a waiver of an FCC rule, you must file that waiver with the FCC first. So normally we'll file an appeal with USAC, and then if we need to, we'll file another appeal with the FCC, or you may just file directly with the FCC if it is a waiver of one of their rules. Okay, notifications. After you file that appeal in the EPIC system, you're going to get an appeal confirmation letter, and that will have a number on it. So you'll want to definitely keep that so that you may follow up on it. And if, just like any other application, appeals will have a reviewer, and those reviewers will reach out through the EPIC system, and they may ask you clarification questions or for any additional thing that they need. And they're going to issue their decision using that RFCDL, the Revised Funding Commitment Decision Letter. And if you don't agree with that, as we said before, you can file an appeal with the FCC. A spin change. A spin change is a change to the ID number or the service provider record for one or more funding requests. And there are two types. One is the corrective spin change. And that generally doesn't change who the service provider is, but it'll correct any kind of data entry error, administrative, clerical error, or it could reflect a merger or acquisition. Many of you remember Time Warner became Charter, Charter became Spectrum. Oh my gosh, these guys merge and acquire that on a daily basis. And that will sometimes affect the provider's ID number. An operational spin change is a change to the service provider, and it's usually made by the applicant. And we'll go into those restrictions in a further slide. But a corrective spin change, and we have quite a few of them over the past few years, because of those mergers and acquisitions and service providers, but they also can correct a data entry error or any other type of administrative clerical error that were not initiated by the applicant, such as, again, if the number is wrong, the spin number is wrong. So when do you file a corrective spin change? On or before the last date to invoice, because you can't invoice if the invoice doesn't agree with that service provider number. The money won't flow. Service providers can put in these spin change requests when they change their numbers, as long as that change affects all of their funding requests. So it'll be like a global type of spin change where it's across the board. A corrective spin change can also be done before the funding commitment decision letter by filing a RAL modification, and we briefly touched on that. That's receipt acknowledgement letter modification, or it can be done through notifying your PIA reviewer. They can get it done as well. An operational spin change, a little bit more complex. They are allowable under your state and local procurement rules and under the contracts of the contract terms between you, the applicant, and the original service provider. And I can just think of different things that have happened that I'll give you examples of. We had a WAN provider change in one of the districts, and the new provider was to start services on July 1st. Well, 4 of the schools in that WAN were not ready. That new service provider didn't have it ready, and they had to stay with their former service provider for several months till the new service provider was able to get them up and running. So they had to file a spin change because they had to change over. They got funded for the new service provider, but they were still having to pay the old service provider. So they had to go in and request that operational spin change. So we can help with that. And it has to be done before that last date to invoice, or, like I said, the money will not flow. Okay, another thing that we're going to go into is service substitutions. And this could be similar to the spin change. You could have to do both, a spin change and a service substitution. Here are the rules for the substituted products or services. They must have the same functionality as the ones that were originally approved. They cannot violate any of the contract or procurement laws. And it cannot result in an increase in the percentage of ineligible services or the functions. And they have to be within the same scope of that establishing FCC Form 470, including any of the RFP docs for those original products and services. So they can't cost more, and they must do the same thing. Okay? When do you file these? In general, after you receive the RAL modification and on or before the last day to receive service. And service providers can file the global service substitution to replace a product or service across all of the funding requests that have it, usually because that product or service is being discontinued or something along those lines. Extensions, we get a lot of these too. Service delivery deadline extension. Now, the funding commitment decision letter is issued by USAC, and it's usually well after March 1st, but it can be issued anytime after March 1st of the funding year, which is an automatic extension. So you get if it's funded that late, it can be automatically extended. A spend change or service substitution that is approved on or after March 1st of the funding year, that also gets an automatic extension. But I will warn everybody, keep track of it. We always try to keep track of it because sometimes it has not automatically been done. So in that case, you'll need us to do some contacting of USAC on your behalf if it doesn't automatically get done. But we need to always track it to make sure it does. Or if you requested the extension because your service provider couldn't complete the delivery and install for reasons beyond their control. Okay? And this also requires another form, Form 500. Before September 30th of the funding year, which is the last of the service delivery deadline dates. Okay, if the applicant requested an extension because the service provider has been unwilling to complete it, I don't even want to go there, then that would be, you would need a service delivery deadline extension to figure out what you're going to do. And also filing that Form 500 before September 30th of the funding year. An invoice deadline extension. Applicants and service providers may request a one-time 120-day extension of the deadline to file an invoice, the FCC Form 472 or FAIR form. Or the service provider invoice form is the 474. And you have to submit a deadline extension request on or before that invoice deadline date. And if an invoice deadline extension request is not submitted in a timely fashion, you'll have to first submit a waiver request, which is an appeal, to the FCC. And first, the FCC must grant that waiver request before USAC will extend the invoice deadline extension. So it gets pretty complicated if you don't do your billing in time, and you usually should be able to do that on time. Let's talk briefly about the FCC Form 500. We probably won't see as many of those now that we've gone to the Category 2 district-wide budgeting. This was used quite a bit when we had school-by-school budgeting. The Form 500 adjusts it does several things. It does, first, it'll adjust the approved funding. It will extend the contract expiration date or correct it. It'll change the service start date that you put on your 486. It'll cancel or reduce the funding request number. And that's the one I was referring to with Category 2. Maybe we won't see as many of these now. Or it will request an extension of the deadline for the delivery of the non-recurring services. So you don't have to do one for the Category 1 recurring services, but you will have to do it for Category 2 funding reductions that were in the previous years. If you don't use all of that funding that was committed, you can return those funds committed but not invoiced to your 5-year Category 2 budget. So those will be the ones that we will probably see more of in the 2021 forward. Okay. And here I just said the Form 500 for 2016 and forward, you'll file that and certify it in EPIC. Form 500 for the previous funding years are on paper and get scanned and uploaded. And they return those committed funds back to your budget. Program compliance. Oh boy, my favorite subject topic, document retention, and we're going to do an entire training on document retention because this is huge with E-rate. You must keep all your documentation for 10 years from the last date to receive service. And in multi-year contracts, that means 10 years from that contract expiration date. So it's not just 10 years. It could be 20 years. It could be 25 years. It could be quite a few more than 10 years if you look at what this really means and looking at contracts. You'll need to retain your receipt and your delivery records that relate to all of these processes, pre-bidding, bidding contracts, the application, any invoices you have, anything about your services, or any other matters that relate to applications. For example, the recurring Internet access service for fiscal year 2020, both the applicant and service provider must retain all their records until at least June 30, 2031. And that's when you say, just don't throw anything away. Just
Amen.
Keep it all. Okay. Another thing that you must do, you must have and keep up to date is an asset inventory. And so everything that you receive, hard goods, E-rate equipment, and locations need to be kept in an asset inventory. And we're even talking cabling. We had one applicant who ordered all of their E-rate cabling to be a specific color, so they would know what year it was. And, you know, there are all different ways to do asset inventory. We can hook you up with some other folks that you can network with and maybe not have to reinvent the wheel for your asset inventory. But this is aside and apart from your regular finance department asset inventory. This is your E-rate asset inventory. So you're going to track every time you move that equipment or any time the equipment has to be returned to the manufacturer, anytime you get a replacement for something, and you need to have those serial numbers as well as the FRNs that they were purchased on. Okay.
Can I interrupt just a minute? I want to talk about RMAs just a minute, the replacement pieces. If you have a piece of E-rate equipment go bad and you have to do an RMA and get a replacement, and you temporarily take something off your shelf, replace the E-rate equipment so that you can keep functioning until the new equipment comes in for the RMA, that replacement equipment through the RMA goes back where the E-rate equipment was. If it's at an access point, it goes back into service where the E-rate equipment was. It does not go on the shelf because, in essence, that equipment that's coming in through the RMA is E-rate equipment. E-rate equipment cannot go on the shelf. I will repeat that. E-rate equipment does not go on the shelf. Even E-rate equipment that is replaced via RMA, once that RMA equipment comes in, it has to go into the place where the bad equipment was taken from. Yes, that's extra work, but E-rate equipment does not sit on the shelf. And if you have a piece that goes bad and it is not 5 years old, then the new equipment that comes in to take its place must go back into that place, not on a shelf, okay? Because you are breaking one of E-rate's rules right then and there by putting E-rate equipment on a shelf. You cannot shelve E-rate equipment until it's 5 years old. Then it doesn't matter what you do with it. You can take it out of service after 5 years. So you can put it on a shelf. You can sell it, whatever you want to with it. But it has to stay in service for 5 years. So you need to make a special note of that. If you have to RMA something, when the replacement comes in, it needs to go back where the bad equipment was. And you need to make sure you put all that information in your asset inventory. And you don't have to have 2 inventories. It can all be one great big one. That's fine. Just make sure your E-rate equipment is noted, that it's E-rate, and you have the FRN, so forth and so on. Okay, sorry, Rebecca.
Oh, that's great. Great information there. And asset inventory, when we go to boot camp, we have one applicant up in the mountains, well, sort of, in Cleveland County, and he's got an asset inventory with links in it to all of his packing lists, to his invoices, and he just made this thing incredibly versatile, and the ability to track is just fantastic. So we usually, during those boot camps, ask, and maybe we'll, during our documentation workshop, I'm hoping to get this applicant to share some of that with us.
That would be great, yes.
Because,
and Rebecca mentioned, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, whenever we run across folks that have just done great things, we do like them to share it with each other, network with each other, and hopefully make this system easier to manage for all of our E-rate applicants.
Exactly. And Rebecca mentioned one thing when she said packing slips. If you order equipment with Category 2, you need to make sure whoever hits those boxes when they hit your shipping area or your loading dock, those packing slips need to come to you as the E-rate person and go into your documentation. You must keep your packing slips as well, okay? All right.
Yeah. Okay, gift rule. This is a live link to our gift rule, which we've talked about before. We did get a waiver this year, an FCC waiver on the gift rule. For, I believe, does it go to December? No, it goes to the end of the funding year this year.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that is specifically so that applicants could accept some piece of equipment.
Demo equipment, correct. Demo. Oh, and also, not demo, but I'm sorry, hotspots. Mm-hmm.
Right. So that is, but they're not saying that you can accept a trip to Hawaii from the vendor.
And yeah, and it's only for a certain time, and to get to this COVID issue, and it hasn't been extended past 2019-20, so I think they're going to look at the extension since COVID really hasn't, gotten any better per se. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a link to the actual gift rules.
Can you see the gift rule page that I pulled up? Or
yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we touched briefly on it in a previous training about getting in trouble with these free gifts. And you definitely don't want to get into trouble with it. So the best way is just not to take anything. But if you do have a need and during this gift waiver, talk with us first.
The best thing for you guys to do is to go down here and watch the video.
Right.
It's short, sweet, and it'll cover everything you need.
Okay.
Whoops, sorry. Oh, dang it. This is not going to be a good recording. Sorry.
Just fine. We'll talk very briefly on the red light rule. Everybody knows what a red light is. If you're a driver, if you're not a driver, if just passengers, you know when you see a red light, you got to stop. That means stop. The Treasury is not going to give this applicant any funding, period. If the vendor's under a red light rule, no invoice is going to be paid to that vendor. And if your applicant, is on a red light, any pending applications you have may be denied, or I guess any federal money could fall within that as well. Is that right, Roxy?
Yes, because the money now lies with the U.S. Treasury. Yes, it could.
Yeah. And E-rate money used to not be Treasury money till year before last, and now it is Treasury money. So red light, you're not getting any money, and you're not getting it from the vendor either.
So if you don't pay your bills to your vendors and they can't get this resolved, they can have you put on red light status as a school or as a library or whatnot, and you don't want to go there.
No, you do not. Here's a link to Whistleblower. And if you know of someone in the E-rate system who has mismanaged, misapplied, violated laws, rules, you can file Whistleblower. There's the link, and it'll be looked into.
Exactly.
Okay. Other reviews. Oh my goodness, there are so many, Roxy.
Yeah, we're not going to go into these hyperlinks, but you can read about them. But these are the three most common.
Payment quality assurance. If you file fares, which we at the state do, and if it hits a certain amount or a certain time or whatever their algorithms are, you'll get a payment quality assurance review, and they'll ask you maybe for copies of invoices or any other thing that they want to see to review the payment before they send it out. Selective review. We had quite a few of these this year that we're in right now that went on during PIA reviews. So we had 2 reviews going on at the same time. And that's where certain FRNs will be selected, and they'll be reviewed way back to the first document you have. They're looking at dates. They're looking at the way you did things. They're looking at everything with the microscope. And the Big Daddy, that's how I remember BCAP. I call it the Big Daddy. The Beneficiary and Contributor Audit Program. Roxy and I both had one of those going on in some of our regions recently, and they are huge audits, and they have I'd say a set. Is that right, Roxy? Like about 35, a list of about 35 separate questions.
Yes.
That go on, and they're pretty much standardized, but of course the answers aren't standard depending on the applicant, but they're in depth and they can go on a long time. As selective reviews can go on a long time as well.
Yeah, and this one includes an on-site visit for 2 to 3 days.
Yeah.
Yep, so it is the Big Daddy, as Rebecca mentioned.
And they're random. They're not based on how much you ask for. You can have one FRN forever and ever. In fact, we did. One of the schools that got a BCAP audit had one FRN one year, and it was $25,000.
Yes, totally random. But as you know, with any federal program, they have to be reviewed and they have to be audited. That is just the way the government works. So the key here is to follow the rules, and if you're unclear of the rules, ask Rebecca and I for help. That's what we're here for.
But that documentation piece is absolutely essential. If you've got that down, you will fly through one of these.
Exactly. Okay, it's now time for questions and answers. I know this was a lot today, a full session for an hour, because it pretty much finished everything else out for you. And remember, all of this is further explained in our handbook, which we've already shared the link with you. If anybody needs it again, you can put that in the chat. I see a question that says, what about the links for this session and last session? Last session is already posted on our website under training, the slide deck and the recording, and this session will go up as well.
Be sure when you're looking on our website to look at the date, because we had the first beginner session was, I believe, on the 10th, the second in the series on the 17th, and then this one on the 24th. There are 3 different new applicant sessions. The other sessions, we've had a watch and learn as well as an admin window session in between the 10th and the 24th as well.
Okay, and here's another question. Do we have to provide public notice in a hearing if our schools are daycare pre-K? If so, where online can I see the SEPA documentation that was provided last year? Because you have pre-K and that they're on the internet, yes. And if you're using E-rate money, yes. You must have an internet policy, you must comply with SEPA, and you must follow all of that rules. Where online can I see the SEPA documentation that was provided last year? This is coming from a new person that has just taken over. I cannot answer that question. It would have to be somewhere in the files that the previous person maintained for your site, and I cannot tell you where that is. They're not uploaded anywhere. That's just kept on site. And yes, I will put a link to the manual in, or maybe Rebecca, you can, so I don't have to pull up, take down a presentation. If you could put a link to the manual in the chat box, Rebecca, if you have it.
I don't know if I can. I can get to it, but is it on our website?
Yes, it is. Mm-hmm.
Is it resources? I'm trying to find it.
Other questions from today? There is no deadline for the public notice, but if you're filing and you do a 486 for funding year 2021 and you check that SIPA box that you're compliant, you need to have been compliant. So I would go ahead and have that box checked, or make sure you have that public notice done and that meeting held before you file that 486, which is probably going to be over sometime in the summer or early fall. Karen, okay, thank you, Rebecca. That's the link for the live binder, which is our handbook. Karen Barker, I don't understand what you're saying. Or maybe I'm looking, oh, I'm saying, for the public notice, if each school holds a session going over expectations, students using Chromebooks and internet, does that count? No, ma'am. Or is this for the education that you're talking about? The education piece? Public notice, no ma'am. That public notice needs to be held at the district office for your policy. That has nothing to do with students at school. This is a school board, internet policy, school board meeting. That's what this is, at the LEA level or the school level. It has nothing to do with students.
I'm going to put another
You're welcome.
link in here. commonsensemedia.org. This group has
this is perfect for SIPA for using with kids. Yes, ma'am.
Right. They have a curriculum already. If you click on at the top of after you get into the site for educators, and they have the SIPA documents for providing the education to your students on digital citizenship and all of the things that'll keep you compliant. So they've already done it for you, so you don't have to redo it all over again on yourself. And another thing that we didn't mention, but during documentation, we talk about an evergreen binder. Now, things that you have, such as your the meeting that you held, your board meeting, where you announced your policy and had it adopted by the board, that is not going to change because you needed the one meeting, one time, and you needed those meeting minutes and proof that that was done. That needs to be kept in what we call an evergreen binder. And the last one, we talked about the big audit, the BCAP audit, and some of these other audits. If they come and ask to see your SIPA compliance, you have that. And they do in the BCAP. They want to see the board meeting minutes and where that policy sits. So having copies of these policies in an evergreen binder, having those already ready.
Yes. Excellent. And one thing I'll talk about, I did during the documentation workshop that we're going to do, I did E-rate at a fairly large school district for many years, and my documentation retention kind of evolved while I was there, what I inherited versus what I graduated to, because you tend to make it your own. But it worked for me, and I had everything very organized and at my fingertips. But I'll talk about how I kept my evergreen binder versus how I kept everything else as well, because you have to determine what works for you, but also how it's going to work when you walk out the door and someone else walks in there, and can they have everything at their fingertips. No one should be hunting anything when you walk out the door. No one. It should all be there for someone to pick up. This is a federal program. It's not a lesson plan. So it should be at someone else's fingertips.
And during our documentation workshop, we will really get into the nuts and bolts of how to organize and keep your documents and what needs to be kept, let's just say right now, all of it forever.
Exactly. Exactly. All right, we've kept you over your hour. If no one has any other questions, we'll go ahead and end the session. We appreciate you taking your time, and we hope to see you all on December 9th to join us for our documentation retention workshop. The registration is on our website. Have a good afternoon, everyone, and happy Thanksgiving.